The Hells Angels biker heard the little girl cry beneath a fallen shelf, and what he did next terrified everyone there. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin today's story. It was late in the afternoon when the rumble of a Harley-Davidson broke the silence of the quiet suburban neighborhood. Jake Reaper Morrison, a grizzled Hells Angels biker, had just finished a long ride through the winding roads, and now he was making his way back to the club's old hangout. He had the weight of the world on his shoulders, as he always did, but there was something calming about the rhythmic hum of his motorcycle, a sound that helped him push away the darkness that clouded his mind. As Jake rolled down the street, he slowed near a row of old houses, his eyes scanning the quiet scene. But suddenly, a faint sound cut through the air, a sound that made his heart stop, the soft, desperate cry of a little girl. His instincts kicked in immediately. The roar of the engine faded as he cut the throttle and coasted to a stop. The sound was coming from an old house on the corner, one that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It wasn't the first time Jake had heard a cry, but something about this one felt different, urgent. Without a second thought, he dismounted his bike and headed toward the house. His boots thudded heavily on the cracked sidewalk as he approached the porch. He could hear the girl's cries growing louder, her voice breaking through the eerie quiet of the neighborhood. Jake's hand instinctively went to the leather jacket that bore the Hells Angels patches, but he didn't hesitate. He was a biker, feared by many, but in this moment, he wasn't a biker. He was a man answering the cry for help. As he stepped onto the porch, his eyes landed on the front door, slightly ajar. He could hear the faint sound of something, maybe something falling, inside. The cries continued, a mix of fear and pain. With one swift motion, Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The house was dim, lit only by the fading light of the afternoon. The air smelled musty, as though the place had been abandoned for years. He moved quietly, his boots barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floorboards. As he reached the living room, he froze. Beneath a toppled bookshelf, a small figure was trapped, a little girl with wide, tear-filled eyes, her tiny body pinned under the heavy wooden structure. She was struggling, her face contorted in pain. Without thinking, Jake rushed to her side. He knelt down beside her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. The little girl's fear was palpable, and she looked up at him with the kind of desperation Jake had seen too many times in his life. Her small voice quivered as she whispered, "Please, don't hurt me. I can't move." Jake's heart clenched. His tough exterior melted away as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. "I'm not going to hurt you, kid," he said in a low, calm voice, his words soft yet firm. "I'm here to help." The girl's eyes flickered with doubt, but Jake didn't back down. He grabbed the edge of the fallen shelf and, with a grunt, lifted it off of her, freeing the small child from its weight. As she wriggled free, Jake could see the bruises on her arms and face. The girl was hurt, but there was no time to waste. He scooped her up in his arms, careful not to jostle her, and stood up. Her small frame was light in his arms, but the weight of the situation felt heavy on his chest. He needed to get her out of here, and fast. Just as he turned toward the door, a loud crash echoed from the back of the house, followed by a voice, rough and angry, shouting, "Where the hell is she?" Jake's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the girl that was in danger now. Something was terribly wrong here. As the girl clung to him, trembling, Jake's mind raced. Whoever had caused her pain was still out there, and they weren't going to let her go that easily. "I'm not going to hurt you, kid," Jake said again, his voice softer now, but still firm. He shifted the little girl in his arms, making sure she felt secure, and moved quickly toward the door. The shouts from the back of the house were growing louder. The sense of urgency hit Jake like a truck, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The girl's frail body clung to him, and her face, pale and bruised, was filled with terror. Jake's heart raced, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Whoever was back there wasn't just looking for her, they were dangerous. He pushed the front door open with his foot, glancing around the yard. The sky was turning dark, the last of the daylight vanishing as the storm clouds rolled in. He could already hear the distant rumble of thunder. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. He was in deep, and he couldn't let them take her again. Jake turned toward his bike, parked just across the street. The Harley was his only option now. It was quick, it was reliable, and it was his escape route. The storm hit just as he made it to the bike, the first raindrops splashing against his jacket. He had to hurry. "Hold on tight, kid," Jake muttered as he gently placed the girl on the back of his bike. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, still trembling. The engine roared to life with a deep, throaty sound that broke the tension for just a second. The world seemed to blur around them as Jake revved the engine, steering the bike down the narrow street. The girl's grip on him tightened as the wind whipped through their hair, but Jake knew this was the only chance they had. He had to get her out of there. As he turned the corner, the loud screech of tires made him flinch. He didn't have to look to know they were being followed. The distant sound of another engine roaring to life confirmed his suspicion. He wasn't imagining it. Whoever was chasing them wasn't going to let them get away easily. The road ahead was slick with rain, the windshield fogging up, but Jake kept his focus. He darted through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic, the girl clinging to him, her tiny body pressed against his back. The sound of a car engine revving loudly behind them made Jake's blood run cold. The thud of tires against the wet pavement echoed in his ears, and he could feel the presence of the car closing in. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the headlights of a large black SUV glaring through the mist. "This is not good," Jake muttered under his breath. The SUV was gaining on them fast, and there wasn't much more room to maneuver. He swerved sharply, taking a sharp turn onto a narrower road. The tires screeched as the bike skidded, but Jake kept it steady. "We need to lose them," Jake said, his mind racing. The girl was still holding on to him, her face buried in his jacket as they sped down the road. She was scared, and for good reason. Whoever had done this to her wasn't going to stop. Jake's fingers gripped the handlebars tighter as he slammed on the accelerator, pushing the bike to its limits. The roar of the engine deafened everything else, and the wind hit them like a wall, but Jake didn't care. He was going to get her out of this. Up ahead, he saw the faint glow of headlights cutting through the rain. A truck. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jake made a split-second decision. "Hold on," he told the girl, and without thinking twice, he turned the bike toward the truck. The truck didn't see them coming. Jake gunned the throttle, racing directly toward it, the sound of the bike screaming in the storm. The girl cried out, but Jake ignored it. He had to make sure they weren't followed. He swerved at the last possible moment, cutting in front of the truck with barely inches to spare. The truck's horn blared, but it was too late. Jake twisted the throttle, sending them speeding down a side street that led into a deserted industrial area. They were now in a maze of empty streets, far from the main roads, and Jake took a sharp turn into a narrow alley. He didn't slow down until he reached the end, where a high metal gate blocked the path. Without hesitation, he jumped off the bike, careful not to drop the girl, and pushed her inside a small, empty storage unit. The gate was barely big enough to fit the bike, but Jake managed to squeeze it through. As soon as they were inside, Jake secured the gate behind them. The rain pounded down, but they were hidden for now. He let out a long breath, staring at the girl as she trembled in his arms. "We're safe," Jake said, trying to reassure her, though his own voice betrayed his doubt. He wasn't sure how long they could stay here, or if anyone was still after them, but for now, they were out of harm's way. The girl's small hands clung to him, and her wide eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been expecting that. "You're welcome," he replied quietly. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The danger wasn't behind them yet, and the storm was just beginning. "I'm not sure how much longer we can stay here," Jake said, his voice low, but there was a sense of urgency in it. The small storage unit they had taken refuge in was dim and cold, the only sound the steady tapping of rain against the metal walls. Outside, the storm was only getting worse, but inside, it felt as if the real danger was just beginning. The girl clung to him, her small body trembling from more than just the cold. She was scared, and Jake didn't blame her. He could feel her fears seep into him as well, like a weight on his chest. Jake pulled the girl closer, wrapping his arms around her to give her whatever comfort he could. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel alone in this mess. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," Jake murmured, though deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely in his control. He could already hear the distant rumble of another engine. The SUV. They were still out there, searching for them. The girl was in danger, and the longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that the people who had hurt her would find them. He couldn't let that happen. His mind raced, going over options, but none of them seemed good enough. "I need to get you out of here," Jake said, mostly to himself. He stood up, carefully holding the girl in his arms again. "Stay close," he told her. "And whatever happens, don't make a sound." They slipped out of the storage unit and moved into the alley, Jake's boots hitting the wet pavement quietly. The storm had turned the streets into a maze of puddles and mud. Every footstep was a risk, but Jake didn't hesitate. He wasn't sure how much longer the girl's safety would last if they stayed here, so he had to keep moving. As they rounded the corner, Jake spotted the SUV parked at the far end of the alley. It was hard to make out details through the rain, but he could see the outline of the vehicle and make out the figures of two men standing by the door. Jake didn't need to be told that these were the people who had been after the girl. He could feel it in his gut. They were here, and they weren't leaving until they had her. "Shit," Jake cursed under his breath. He looked around, searching for an escape route, but all he saw were narrow streets and dead ends. He was boxed in, and so was the girl. There was no way out without a fight, and Jake wasn't about to put her in danger. He had to act, and fast. His eyes landed on a fire escape ladder just above them. It was a long shot, but it was their best bet. "Come on," Jake said, pulling the girl closer as they moved toward the building. The rain was coming down harder now, but Jake was determined to make it. He reached the fire escape and gripped the cold metal ladder. His fingers were slick with rain, but he didn't let that stop him. Slowly, he started climbing, holding the girl tightly against him, his heart pounding in his chest. When they finally reached the top, he set her down, and they crouched together behind the edge of the roof. Jake peered over, watching the men below. They hadn't noticed them yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. The night felt heavy, the air thick with tension. He didn't know how long they could stay hidden, but he had to do everything he could to keep her safe. "You okay?" Jake whispered, glancing down at the girl. She nodded, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. He could see the exhaustion in her small frame. The toll this night had already taken on her. He wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, but he couldn't make that promise. "Not yet. We're just going to stay here for a little while," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stay quiet, and stay close." The girl nodded again, and Jake let out a slow breath, his mind racing for the next step. They couldn't stay on the roof forever, and the men would likely figure out where they were eventually. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. His eyes scanned the dark streets below, looking for any sign of a way out. That's when he saw it. A motorcycle shop a few blocks down, its lights dimmed but still on. It was their best chance. "Listen to me," Jake said, leaning in closer to the girl. "I need you to trust me. We're going to make a run for that shop down there. Do you think you can do that?" The girl didn't hesitate. "I can do it," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so small. Jake looked down at her, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe they could get through this together. He stood up slowly, keeping his eyes on the men below. When he was sure they weren't looking, he nodded to the girl. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They ran. The rain slammed into their faces as they dashed across the roof, moving quickly and silently. The cold wind bit at Jake's skin, but he didn't let it slow him down. They were almost there. He could see the shop in the distance, just a few more blocks. But as they rounded the corner, Jake's worst fear came true. The men had spotted them. The SUV's headlights flared, and a voice shouted out from below. "There they are!" Jake grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her toward the shop, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could hear the sound of the men chasing them. They were close. Too close. He pushed forward, his legs burning with the effort, the girl still clinging to him. They had to make it. They had no other choice. "I can hear them," the girl whispered, her voice trembling as she clung to Jake's side. The pounding of boots on wet pavement echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. They were closing in. "Don't look back," Jake whispered, his voice sharp but calm. He knew they couldn't afford to slow down, not now. His eyes flicked to the motorcycle shop just ahead, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope in the storm. But as they pushed forward, a sharp pain shot through Jake's leg. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the slick pavement. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down, the fear rising in his chest like a tidal wave. The girl's grip tightened around his arm, and he could feel her fear, too. "Stay with me," Jake growled, trying to push past the pain. He couldn't afford to stop. They were almost there. The shop was only a few steps away now, but Jake could hear the men gaining on them. The sound of their footsteps was deafening, a constant reminder that they were running out of time. As they reached the door to the shop, Jake slammed his shoulder into it, forcing it open. The bell above the door jingled, and he quickly pushed the girl inside. The shop was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. It smelled of oil, rubber, and the faint scent of gasoline. The door slammed shut behind them, but Jake could hear the men's voices outside, shouting orders. They had arrived. Jake turned to the girl, his hand still gripping hers tightly. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but urgent. "I'll be right back. Don't make a sound." The girl nodded, her wide eyes filled with fear. Jake turned and ran toward the back of the shop. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let those men take her again. As he rounded the corner of the shop, he spotted a heavy steel door. It was locked, but Jake knew how to handle that. His fingers moved quickly, pulling out a set of tools from his jacket pocket. The rain was pouring down harder now, the storm outside growing more intense. He didn't have much time. The door clicked open, and Jake slipped inside. The room was filled with old equipment, dusty shelves, and boxes piled high. But in the far corner of the room, there was something that caught his eye. A motorcycle. Not just any motorcycle. A Harley-Davidson. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. The bike he had been waiting for. He had worked on bikes like this before, but this one was different. It was a piece of history. Jake moved toward the bike, his hands itching to get to work. But he knew he couldn't stay here long. He had to get back to the girl. He turned around, but just as he did, he heard the unmistakable sound of the door crashing open. The men had found them. Jake's mind raced. He had to act fast. He grabbed the nearest wrench and swung it toward the door. The men hesitated, but only for a moment. "There's nowhere to run," one of them growled, his voice dripping with menace. Jake tightened his grip on the wrench, his body tense. He had no intention of letting them take the girl. Not without a fight. The first man lunged at him, but Jake sidestepped, using the momentum to throw him into the wall. The second man pulled a knife from his belt, his eyes wild with anger. "You don't know who you're messing with," the man snarled. But Jake was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife fell to the floor. The man screamed in pain, but Jake didn't hesitate. He threw him to the ground and kicked him hard in the chest. The man collapsed, gasping for breath. Jake turned to see the girl standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay inside," he shouted, his voice sharp. "It's not safe out here." She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped back into the shadows of the shop. Jake didn't take his eyes off the men. They weren't done yet. The first man scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth. "You'll regret this," he spat, his hand reaching for a gun tucked in his waistband. Jake's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. He knew how to handle this. He was ready. The man drew the gun, but before he could fire, Jake moved. He dove toward the man, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The gun clattered to the floor, but the man wasn't done. He fought, kicking and struggling, but Jake was stronger. He slammed the man into the ground, pinning him down with all his weight. The second man was still on the ground, groaning in pain, but Jake didn't take his eyes off the first one. "Stay down," Jake said, his voice cold. "You're not going anywhere." The man glared up at him, but he didn't try to get up. Jake stood up slowly, his body aching from the fight. He looked over at the girl, who was still watching from the doorway. "It's over," Jake said, his voice softer now. He walked over to her, his footsteps heavy on the concrete floor. "You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was something else in them now. Relief. She stepped toward him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. Jake stood still for a moment, his heart heavy with everything that had just happened. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The storm was just beginning. "I'm sorry, but you can't stay here," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he didn't want to make. He stood at the threshold of the shop, the storm still raging outside, but the danger that had brought them here was far from gone. He could still hear the sound of tires screeching against the wet pavement, the echoes of angry voices shouting orders. He glanced back at the girl, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I'm sorry," he repeated, but there was no easy way to say it. The shop wasn't safe anymore. He could feel the pressure mounting. The men from the SUV would not stop. The fight was never just about protecting the girl. It had become about survival, and Jake knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The girl looked up at him, still shaking, but there was something else in her gaze now. A glimmer of trust. She knew what Jake was trying to protect her from. She could feel it in the air, the way the storm had intensified, how the tension had stretched thin. "Where will we go?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake didn't have an answer right away. The world outside was a maze, every path uncertain, and he knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't stay where they were, but they couldn't exactly just run without a plan. They needed to get off the streets, somewhere that would give them time to think, to regroup. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the back exit. "There's a place," he said, mostly to himself. "A cabin up north. It's off the grid. No one will find us there." It wasn't perfect, but it was better than staying here and waiting for trouble to find them. The girl nodded, understanding. Without saying another word, she followed Jake as he led her out the back door. The night was cold, the rain coming down harder now, and the wind howled through the alley, but Jake wasn't concerned with the weather. His focus was on getting her to safety. They made their way through the narrow streets, moving quickly and quietly, keeping to the shadows. Jake could still hear the sounds of the men searching for them, their voices distant but growing nearer. He gritted his teeth, urging the girl to move faster. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Jake stopped and turned to the girl. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We're almost there, but I need you to promise me something. If anything happens, if we get separated, you stay hidden. You find a place to wait. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, her expression serious. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. Jake looked at her, his heart aching. She was just a kid, but she was stronger than most adults he knew. He couldn't help but admire her resilience. He had to get her to that cabin. They couldn't stop now. They made it to the edge of the city, the lights fading behind them as they entered the dark, quiet country roads. The rain had slowed, but the clouds still hung heavy in the sky. Jake kept his eyes ahead, watching the road closely, making sure they weren't being followed. Every instinct in him told him that they weren't out of danger yet. But there was a part of him, deep down, that allowed himself to hope. The cabin was close now. He could see the flickering light in the distance, a small beacon of safety. They weren't there yet, but they were so close. Just a little further. As they continued on, Jake's mind raced, his thoughts moving faster than the bike could go. What would happen when they got to the cabin? What if the men found them? What if he couldn't protect her? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud noise from behind them. He spun around, his heart skipping a beat. The headlights were there. They had found them. The SUV was close, much closer than he had anticipated. The men were not far behind, and Jake knew they were running out of time. He pushed the bike harder, urging it to go faster, but the sound of the pursuing vehicle only grew louder. The men were catching up. "Hold on," Jake shouted to the girl, who clung to him as they sped down the road. The headlights behind them were blinding now, and Jake could hear the engine growling in pursuit. He swerved left, then right, trying to lose them, but they were relentless. The rain made the road slippery, and Jake fought to keep control of the bike. He glanced over his shoulder again and saw the men drawing closer. There was no way to outrun them. He needed a new plan, and fast. Just ahead, he saw the turnoff to the cabin road. It was a narrow dirt path that led up the mountain, hidden by the trees. It was their only shot. "This way," Jake shouted, veering off the road and into the darkness. The girl screamed as the bike bounced along the rough terrain, but Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. The headlights of the SUV were still visible behind them, but they were losing ground as Jake took the sharp turns of the mountain path. His heart was racing now, the adrenaline pushing him harder, faster. They were almost there. Just a few more minutes, and they would be safe. But the road was treacherous. As they rounded a sharp bend, Jake's bike hit a patch of loose gravel. He tried to correct, but it was too late. The bike slid out from under them, and they were thrown to the ground. Jake's body hit the dirt hard, and he groaned in pain. He rolled over quickly, checking on the girl. She was still on the ground, but she was moving. "Are you okay?" he asked, urgently, his hands trembling as he helped her to her feet. The girl nodded, tears in her eyes, but she didn't speak. Jake helped her back onto the bike, his heart pounding. They weren't safe yet. He could hear the SUV coming closer, and they didn't have much time left. He revved the engine, feeling it growl beneath him, and pushed forward. They were so close to safety. "I don't think we're gonna make it," Jake muttered under his breath as the sound of the SUV's engine grew louder behind them. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the handlebars tightly, trying to keep the bike steady on the narrow, treacherous mountain path. The loose gravel beneath the wheels made the bike slide dangerously, but Jake didn't have the luxury of slowing down. The girl was still clinging to him tightly, her face buried against his back, her small body shaking from fear. "We're almost there," Jake whispered, but even to his own ears, the words felt hollow. The cabin was just up ahead, hidden deep in the woods, but the SUV was gaining on them. Every turn, every bump in the road, seemed to push them closer to the edge. They needed to lose them, and fast. The headlights of the SUV flashed behind them, cutting through the heavy rain like two hunting eyes. Jake looked ahead, scanning the dark forest, hoping to spot any sign of the cabin's entrance. The storm was relentless now, the wind howling around them, and the rain so thick that Jake could barely make out the road in front of him. Just as he rounded a sharp corner, the rear tire of the bike slid out, sending them both tumbling toward the edge of the path. "Hold on," Jake yelled, trying to regain control. The bike fishtailed, but Jake managed to steer it back onto the road just in time, his heart racing as he pushed the throttle even harder. The sound of the SUV's engine was deafening now, almost at their backs, but Jake refused to look. He focused only on the path ahead, forcing the bike to go faster despite the slippery road. They were almost there. Through the rain, Jake could barely make out the silhouette of the cabin at the end of the path. His muscles screamed in protest, his body aching from the stress of the chase, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the girl down. The SUV's headlights were nearly on top of them now. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the handlebars harder. The storm was still beating down on them, the noise of the rain deafening, but Jake's focus was laser-sharp. "Just a little further," he muttered, more to himself than the girl. As the cabin came into view, Jake's heart skipped a beat. But just as he thought they were safe, the sound of screeching tires cut through the storm. The SUV wasn't far behind, and it was clear the men weren't going to give up easily. They were almost there, but the distance between them and safety was closing in fast. Jake turned the bike hard to the left, pushing the throttle as far as it would go. His heart raced in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could see the porch light flickering ahead, the cabin just a few hundred feet away. His pulse quickened. The men had almost caught up. He needed to make a decision, fast. "Hold on," Jake shouted again, urging the bike to go even faster. The girl clung to him tightly, her breath quick and shallow against his back. As they neared the cabin's front yard, Jake slammed the bike into a hard turn, the gravel kicking up behind them. The rear tire slipped again, but Jake kept control, his eyes locked on the small porch that led into the safety of the cabin. But as they reached the front yard, the sound of the SUV's tires on the wet gravel was louder than ever. They were almost there, almost at the cabin. And then, without warning, the SUV's headlights flared brightly, blinding Jake for just a moment. In that split second, a man stepped out of the vehicle, blocking their path. Jake slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The bike skidded to a halt just inches from the man. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he looked up, his eyes locking with the figure standing before him. The man's face was covered in shadows, but his stance was confident, and the gun in his hand gleamed in the rain. "Not so fast," the man said, his voice cold. "You're not going anywhere." Jake's heart sank. He had no way out. The cabin was right there, but the man with the gun was blocking their only escape. "Let her go," Jake said, his voice low and steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "You don't have to do this." The man chuckled darkly, the sound carrying through the rain. "You're in no position to make demands," he said, taking a step forward. Move aside, or I'll make sure you both regret it. Jake's mind raced. He had no choice now. The gun in the man's hand was a serious threat, but he wasn't going to let the girl fall into their hands again. Without thinking, Jake kicked the bike into gear, revving the engine with all the force he could muster. The tires screeched as he slammed the throttle, charging straight toward the man blocking their way. The man's eyes widened in surprise as Jake gunned the bike toward him. With only a split second to react, the man lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the bike's path. Jake didn't stop. He pushed the bike forward, the girl clinging tightly to him as they sped past the man, heading straight for the cabin. But just as they reached the porch, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The bullet whizzed past him, narrowly missing his shoulder. He didn't look back. His mind was focused solely on the cabin ahead. He could see the door now, just a few feet away. He pushed the bike harder, ignoring the burning in his muscles, the fear coursing through him. They were almost there, just a little further. The gunfire echoed in the distance, but Jake didn't let it slow him down. He reached the porch, slammed the bike to a stop, and jumped off, grabbing the girl and pulling her inside. He slammed the door behind them, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. They were inside, safe for now. But Jake knew this wasn't over. The danger wasn't gone yet. Not by a long shot. I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up, Jake muttered, his voice hoarse as he paced back and forth in the cabin. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling and rain battering against the windows, but inside, the cabin felt cold and tense. His eyes darted between the girl, who sat huddled on the couch, and the door that led outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking just beyond the threshold. The girl had fallen silent since they entered the cabin, her small body curled up under an old blanket as she tried to get some rest. But Jake knew she was just as terrified as he was. He could see it in her eyes. They weren't safe yet. He didn't know how long they had until the men found them again. They'd gotten away, sure, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. He wasn't about to let his guard down. Jake looked at the girl once more. She was still clutching her teddy bear, the same one she'd held when he first found her. It was the only thing that seemed to calm her, though it couldn't protect her from what was coming. He had to think. He had to come up with a plan. We can't stay here long, Jake said quietly, more to himself than to the girl. They'll find us eventually. I know they will. He rubbed his hand over his face, exhausted, his mind racing. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be a place where they could hide, a place where no one would think to look. But where? And how? The cabin wasn't much, just a small, isolated retreat tucked away in the woods, but Jake had grown up in places like this. He knew how to survive in the wild. But surviving with a kid? That was a whole different challenge. He couldn't protect her forever, and deep down, he knew it. But he had to try. He had to do whatever it took to keep her safe. He walked to the window, peering through the cracked glass to the world outside. The rain had slowed, but the clouds still hung heavy in the sky, as if the storm was waiting to come back full force. The wind was picking up again, rattling the trees and bending them low. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkness. He didn't see any signs of movement, but he knew better than to trust his instincts now. He turned back to the girl, who was still staring at him, her wide eyes filled with silent questions. I'm going to make sure the place is secure, he said, his voice low and calm. Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone. The girl nodded, and though she was still frightened, there was a flicker of trust in her eyes. She had no choice but to trust him. He was all she had left. Jake moved quickly, checking every window and door to make sure they were locked tight. He didn't hear the sound of the SUV outside anymore, but he knew it wasn't over. The men weren't just going to give up. They would come looking for them, sooner or later. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, feeling the weight of the gun tucked into the waistband. It was a last resort, something he'd hoped never to use. But in situations like this, it was better to be prepared. He stepped outside for a moment, taking a deep breath as the cold air hit his face. The forest around him was dark and still, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. He listened carefully, his senses on high alert. He didn't hear anything. No footsteps. No voices. But something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he scanned the trees, his hand resting on the gun. It was too quiet. He quickly returned inside, locking the door behind him. The girl looked up at him, and Jake gave her a reassuring smile. though he didn't feel it. Everything's fine, he lied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But she wasn't buying it. She knew the truth, just like he did. They weren't safe. I'll figure this out, he said, trying to reassure both of them. He knew they couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to keep moving. But where? The thought gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. The door slammed open. Jake froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He didn't have time to react. The man stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the storm. The gun in his hand gleamed in the low light. You think you're safe? The man growled. Jake didn't hesitate. His hand moved instinctively to the gun at his side, but before he could pull it free, the man took a step forward, blocking the door. Stay away from her, Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man smirked, taking another step closer. You think you can stop me? You're a dead man already. Jake's pulse quickened as he slowly stepped toward the man. The girl was still behind him, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with fear. Jake didn't care. He had to protect her. He had no choice. The man lunged at him, but Jake was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The gun clattered to the floor, and the man screamed in pain. Jake didn't stop. He slammed the man into the wall, knocking the breath out of him. But the man wasn't done. He fought back, kicking and thrashing, but Jake held firm, his muscles straining as he pushed the man to the ground. The man groaned in pain, unable to get up. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart still pounding. You're not taking her, Jake said coldly. The man stared up at him, his eyes filled with hatred. You'll regret this, he spat. Jake didn't reply. He didn't need to. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone, take her. Not again. I'm not going to let you go, Jake growled, his breath coming in heavy gasps as he stood over the man. The guy was struggling on the floor, but Jake didn't care. He wasn't about to let anyone threaten the girl, not after everything they'd been through. The man's face was contorted in pain, but Jake wasn't going to show mercy. The girl had been through enough already. He wasn't going to let this go any further. He stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning the room, looking for something that would help him control the situation. The cabin was dimly lit, but it was safe, for now. He had to keep it that way. The man groaned, his hands trying to push himself up, but Jake quickly moved to block his way. Stay down, Jake commanded, his voice harsh. The man's eyes narrowed, filled with anger and disbelief. You'll regret this, he spat, trying to gather the strength to stand. Jake wasn't fazed. His entire body was on alert, his muscles tense, ready to react at any moment. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. If you come near her again, Jake said, his voice unwavering, I'll make sure you never walk again. The man's eyes flickered with fear, but Jake saw the hesitation in him. The fight had drained out of him for now. He wasn't a threat anymore. Jake knew he had to get rid of him. He couldn't afford to take chances. Without saying another word, Jake bent down, grabbed the man by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. The man winced in pain, but Jake didn't care. Get out, Jake ordered, his voice cold and firm. The man took a step back, his eyes still burning with hatred, but he didn't make a move to challenge Jake. He wasn't in any position to do so. With one last glare, the man turned and stumbled toward the door. Jake followed him, making sure the man left without incident. As the door slammed shut, Jake let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing. It wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. Jake turned back toward the girl, who was still sitting in the corner, watching him. Her eyes were wide, but there was something else in them now. Trust. It was the first time she'd looked at him like that. It hit Jake harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being trusted. He wasn't used to anyone looking at him like that, but in this moment, it meant everything. You're safe now, Jake said softly, walking over to her. He knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. The girl nodded, her small form still trembling, but she didn't look as frightened as before. Thank you, she whispered, her voice small and shaky. Jake smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was still too much to worry about. They couldn't stay here. Not with the storm still raging and the danger still looming. Jake needed to get them out of here, but where? He wasn't sure how long they had before the men would come back, and he couldn't afford to waste time. The girl needed to be safe. He needed to make sure she stayed safe. He stood up and began pacing the room, trying to figure out their next move. The cabin was isolated, and it had been the perfect place to hide for a moment, but he couldn't rely on it for long. The men wouldn't give up that easily. They would come looking for her. They always did. The question was, how could he keep her out of their reach? Jake looked at the girl again, his thoughts racing. She was just a kid, caught up in something she didn't deserve. She didn't ask for any of this, and he hated that she had to deal with it. She deserved better. He could hear the rain pelting against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. The storm was fierce, but it was the least of his worries. He had to think. He had to protect her. "We need to go," Jake finally said, his voice quiet but determined. "I'm going to get you out of here. We're not staying." The girl looked up at him, her face still pale, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew what he meant. It wasn't safe here. It wasn't safe anywhere. Jake grabbed his jacket, his fingers brushing over the familiar weight of the gun in his pocket. He didn't want to use it, but he knew he might not have a choice. He couldn't let the girl down. He couldn't let anyone hurt her again. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," Jake promised, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He wasn't sure how they were going to get out of this, but he would figure it out. He had to. The girl stood up, still trembling but moving toward him. Her small hand reached for his, and Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. He wasn't used to being needed. He wasn't used to caring. But something about this kid made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. He pulled her into a hug, just for a second. It was brief, but it meant everything to him. It meant he wasn't in this alone. It meant he wasn't going to let her go. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice soft as he pulled away. He wasn't sure where they were going next, but it didn't matter. He would protect her. He would get them both out of this alive. And he wasn't going to stop until he did. "I don't like this," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the darkened forest around him. The cabin they had found shelter in was no longer a safe haven, not with the storm still raging and the fear of being found lurking just outside the door. He had thought they could hide here for a while, catch their breath, regroup. But the sense of danger was constant, and it was eating away at him. The girl, still clutching her teddy bear, was sitting by the small fireplace, her eyes wide, her hands trembling. She was so small, so vulnerable, but Jake could see the determination in her face. She was scared, but she was tough. She had no choice but to be. Jake walked over to her, his boots heavy on the old wooden floor. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he said softly, though the words didn't feel as solid as he wanted them to be. He couldn't promise that. Not when the men were still out there, looking for them. Not when every turn they took felt like they were only one step ahead of danger. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with that silent understanding. She knew. She knew they weren't out of the woods yet. She was a smart kid, smarter than most adults, and Jake admired that about her. He sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. He needed to think. He needed to plan. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "The men from the SUV, they'll be back. They're not going to stop looking for you." The girl's face tightened with fear, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She was absorbing everything. Jake stood up again, pacing back and forth in the small room, his mind spinning. He had been in tight situations before, but this was different. He wasn't just trying to save himself. He was trying to save her. He wasn't about to let those men get their hands on her again. The thought of what they would do to her if they found her sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. He stopped pacing, standing still for a moment to collect his thoughts. There had to be a way out of this. A way to get them both to safety. But where could they go? The world outside was a maze of danger, and Jake wasn't sure he could keep her safe if they kept running. He turned to the girl, his gaze hard but filled with something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. We'll make it through this," Jake said, the words surprisingly firm, even to him. "I don't know how, but we will. I won't let them hurt you." The girl nodded, her small hand reaching for his. Jake squeezed it gently, trying to offer some comfort, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The only thing that would keep her safe now was getting out of here, and fast. Jake moved to the window, peering out through the rain-streaked glass. The storm had calmed a bit, but the night was still thick with the kind of darkness that made every shadow seem like a threat. His instincts told him that they had to leave. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that they would be found. He turned away from the window, his mind made up. "Pack whatever you need," Jake said to the girl, his voice steady. "We're leaving." She looked up at him, confused. "But where will we go?" she asked, her voice small, the fear creeping back into her eyes. Jake hesitated for a moment. Where could they go? The cabin wasn't safe anymore, and there wasn't anyone he trusted to turn to for help. He had nothing left but his wits and his will to survive. But that had to be enough. "I know a place," Jake said, his voice quiet but resolute. "A cabin up the mountain. It's secluded, and it's the last place they'll think to look." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. The girl looked at him, and for a moment, Jake saw that flicker of trust again. She had no choice but to follow him. She had no one else. Jake grabbed the duffel bag he'd packed earlier and slung it over his shoulder. He walked toward the door, glancing one last time at the girl. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. "We don't stop, no matter what." The girl nodded, standing up slowly, clutching her teddy bear tightly. She was scared, but she was still moving, still following him. Jake opened the door just a crack, peering out into the rain-soaked night. It was now or never. They had to make a break for it. He stepped outside first, keeping low, scanning the area for any signs of movement. He didn't see anything. Not yet. He gestured for the girl to follow, and together, they slipped into the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. The rain had slowed, but the mud made the ground treacherous, each step a careful balance of speed and caution. They moved quickly, not daring to look back. The night was their only ally now. They had to stay ahead of the storm, both the one outside and the one that was chasing them. Jake kept his eyes on the cabin in the distance, the flickering light from a lantern barely visible through the trees. They were close, but they weren't safe yet. Not until they reached the mountain, not until they put as much distance between them and the men in the SUV as possible. As they neared the edge of the trees, the sound of a car engine reached Jake's ears. He froze. They were being followed. Again. "I can't hear them," Jake muttered, the tension rising in his chest as the sound of a car engine grew louder behind them. They had just slipped out of the cabin, and now they were running through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the rain-soaked ground. The girl was still following close behind, her hand tightly clutching his, but Jake could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Every step felt like it could be their last. "We need to hurry," Jake said, his voice low, barely audible over the pounding rain. His heart was racing, his mind working in overdrive as he tried to figure out their next move. The men in the SUV were close now. Jake had heard their engine, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. He wasn't about to let that happen. They couldn't stop running. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. They couldn't risk being cornered again. He pulled the girl closer, urging her to move faster, though he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was small, fragile, but she was hanging on. She had to. "Stay close," Jake whispered, glancing over his shoulder. The headlights of the SUV were now visible through the trees, cutting through the dark night like a predator on their tail. They weren't going to make it much longer. Jake could feel it in his gut. His muscles ached from the constant motion, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but there was no choice. "We're almost there," he said, though he didn't really know if they were. His words were more for himself than for her. He had to believe they could make it. He had to. They were heading toward a secluded cabin up the mountain, a place Jake had been to before. It wasn't much, but it was remote enough that he could get them out of sight for a while. The problem was that the SUV wasn't far behind, and Jake didn't know how long they had before the men caught up. He needed to buy them some time. "I need you to stay low," Jake said, his voice sharp as he motioned for the girl to crouch down. He was about to make a break for it, to lead them off the path and into the woods where they would be harder to track. But as he glanced ahead, he saw something that made his heart stop. There, through the rain, was the glint of another set of headlights. They were surrounded. "Get down," Jake whispered urgently, pulling the girl into the trees just as the sound of another engine roared to life behind them. The men in the SUV weren't the only ones after them. Jake's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't hide. He had to think of something. His eyes darted around the dense woods, searching for any sign of a way out. The rain was coming down harder now, the storm raging above them, but Jake couldn't afford to wait. The headlights of the second vehicle grew brighter, closer. He had to move, and he had to do it now. Jake pulled the girl to her feet, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Follow me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. They needed to get to the cabin, and they needed to get there fast. Stay close, Jake repeated, guiding her through the trees, weaving between the thick trunks of the old pines. He could hear the other vehicle getting closer, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The girl was still clutching his hand, her small body trembling as they moved through the storm. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, each footstep feeling like it was leading them closer to their end. But he couldn't stop. Not until they were safe. Almost there, Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The sound of the engines was still behind them, relentless and growing louder. He glanced over his shoulder once more, his heart sinking as he saw the lights of the vehicle cutting through the trees. They were getting closer, and Jake knew they didn't have much time. He was running out of options. They reached the edge of the clearing, where the cabin stood in the distance. It was isolated, quiet, and hidden from the main road, but it wasn't enough to keep them safe. Jake could already hear the sound of the vehicle speeding up, the men behind them desperate to catch up. He pulled the girl behind a large tree, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of help. But there was no one. There was nowhere to hide. Stay here, Jake whispered to the girl, his voice firm. I'll get them off our tail. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. She didn't argue. She trusted him. Jake's eyes flicked back toward the approaching vehicle. He didn't have time to think. He needed to buy them a few minutes, just long enough for the girl to make it to the cabin. Without another word, Jake sprinted toward the road, moving fast, keeping low to the ground. He didn't look back, didn't slow down. He just ran, hoping that it would be enough. The sound of the vehicles grew louder, and Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. He was running out of time. Just as he reached the edge of the road, he heard the engine of the SUV screech to a halt behind him. He turned to face it, his heart pounding in his chest, ready for whatever came next. He was prepared to fight if he had to. But as the vehicle's headlights blinded him, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The men had already spotted him. He didn't have much time. The girl was still out there, and he wasn't about to let them take her again. I can hear their footsteps closing in, Jake thought, his heart racing as he pressed his back against the thick bark of the tree. The rain had lightened, but the wind still howled, and Jake's fingers gripped the cold, slick gun hidden in his jacket. The sound of the approaching vehicles, tires screeching against the wet road, made his stomach churn. They were close now, much closer than Jake had hoped for. He glanced back toward the cabin, the girl waiting anxiously behind the large tree, her small form barely visible in the shadows, but he could see her eyes, wide with fear. She was depending on him to keep her safe, and Jake wasn't about to let her down. His mind raced as the sound of the engines grew louder, the pursuit relentless. They were trapped. If he didn't act fast, they'd be caught. He took a deep breath, his body tensed as he scanned his surroundings. There were no other places to hide, and the only thing he could rely on now was speed. They couldn't outrun the men in the SUV on foot, not with the rough terrain, not in the storm, but maybe he could lead them away long enough for the girl to make it to safety. I'll distract them, Jake muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper over the wind. He glanced back at the girl, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. She was so young, so vulnerable. He had to buy her time. He wouldn't let them take her. Not again. He had one shot at this. With the girl hidden for now, Jake began moving, slipping silently between the trees, careful to make sure his movements weren't detected. The trees around him were dense, and the rain had softened the ground, making it easier to move without leaving obvious tracks. But the danger wasn't in the forest itself. It was in the eyes of the men who would stop at nothing to find them. He needed to get their attention. That was the plan. He had to make them think he was still out there, running, so they would follow him. His pulse quickened as he rounded the corner, making sure to step heavily on the ground. He needed them to hear him, to think they were close. His eyes were locked on the faint glow of headlights in the distance. They were just a few yards away now, the vehicle moving at a cautious speed, obviously scanning for signs of movement. As they came into view, Jake took a deep breath, making his move. He sprinted forward, his boots thudding loudly against the earth. The men in the SUV heard it, the noise of heavy footsteps breaking the silence. He could see their headlights flash toward him, the car slowing down as the driver spotted him. Jake kept running, weaving between the trees, letting them get a glimpse of him, just enough to keep them following. The engine revved louder, and Jake's heart pounded as he led them further from the cabin. He couldn't look back. He didn't dare. The girls' safety depended on him, keeping their focus on him. He sprinted harder, pushing his legs to their limits, the sound of the car speeding up behind him. But it wasn't enough. Just as Jake was starting to feel the first signs of exhaustion, he heard another noise, voices. The men were talking, shouting to each other as they tried to figure out which direction he'd gone. He could hear their footsteps now, echoing in the woods, and he knew they were getting closer. He needed more time. A sudden idea struck him. He veered off the path, ducking low into the brush, making his way toward a steep incline he knew well. It was treacherous and slippery, but it would slow them down. He had to risk it. He could hear the men calling out now, cursing as they saw the trail he left behind. Jake made his way up the hill, his boots slipping on the wet rocks, but he kept going, praying the men wouldn't catch up before he reached the top. The incline was steep, and the rain was making everything slicker, but he knew the terrain well. He reached the top and stopped, crouching low. The sound of the SUV reached his ears again, closer now, the men yelling, but they were no longer sure of where he had gone. He could hear them scrambling, frustrated, looking for any trace of him. Jake waited for the perfect moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching. The men had given up on the chase, moving back toward the road. Jake exhaled slowly, his body still tense as he listened. He waited until the sound of the SUV faded into the distance, the night returning to its eerie quiet. He let out a long breath, finally allowing himself to relax. But as he stood up, he felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't out of danger yet. He needed to get back to the girl. He turned, making his way back toward the cabin, moving quickly but quietly, every sense on high alert. The worst part of all this wasn't the chase. It was the constant fear that they wouldn't make it out alive. When he reached the cabin, he stopped at the door, glancing around to make sure no one was following. He opened the door slowly, cautiously, not wanting to alert anyone to their presence. Inside, the girl was waiting, just as he had left her. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't move. She knew better than to ask. She knew they had made it through, just barely. Jake walked inside, closing the door quietly behind him. He looked at the girl, her small face full of hope, and his heart clenched. They were safe, for now. But Jake knew they couldn't stay here. The danger was still out there. And this was far from over. "I'm sorry, but we can't stay here much longer," Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows of the cabin. The storm outside had slowed to a drizzle, but the danger they were in still hung heavy in the air. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots, every gust of wind outside made him feel like the world was closing in on them. The girl, sitting quietly in the corner, still had that look of silent understanding. She was no longer crying, but her small body trembled, even now, after everything. Jake's heart clenched. He hated seeing her like this, afraid and lost in a world that didn't make sense. He wished more than anything that he could give her a normal life, a safe life. But the reality was that they were running. And running meant danger at every turn. He turned toward the small fire that crackled weakly in the stone fireplace. The warmth from it barely cut through the cold tension that gripped the room. He needed to keep moving. There was no time to waste. The men were still out there. They'd never stop until they had her. "We need to get to the next town," Jake said softly, his words more to himself than to the girl. "We can't stay here." He rubbed a hand over his tired face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The cabin had given them shelter for a while, but that was all it could offer, temporary safety. The sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed in his mind, and for a moment, he imagined the men in the SUV still hunting for them, still searching, still out there. The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of that quiet strength that had impressed him so much. He could see the fear in her, but also the trust. She wasn't asking questions anymore, wasn't begging to know what was going to happen next. She just nodded, accepting whatever Jake said as the truth. She had no choice. She had to. "All right," Jake said, standing up. "We're moving out. Stay close, and don't make a sound. If anyone sees us, we're done." His voice was low, steady, but there was a steel to it that even Jake recognized. He wasn't playing around anymore. They were out of options. Jake moved quickly, grabbing the duffel bag and throwing it over his shoulder. He picked up the girl, his muscles aching from exhaustion, but he didn't hesitate. They were leaving. He opened the door slowly, just a crack, and peered outside. The rain had stopped, but the world was still damp and cold. It was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, but the night felt darker than ever. He stepped out, motioning for the girl to follow, but keeping a tight grip on her hand. His senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings, listening for any sign of movement. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. They made their way to the trees, Jake leading the way, trying to stay low and quiet. Every step seemed louder than the last, every branch that cracked beneath their feet making Jake's stomach twist in knots. The air was thick with tension. They had to get to the next town, to somewhere safe, but Jake knew that safety was a luxury, and it was slipping further and further out of their reach with every passing moment. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jake heard a rustling sound behind them. His heart skipped a beat. He stopped, motioning for the girl to stay still. The sound wasn't a vehicle. It wasn't the men. At least not yet. He took a deep breath and slowly turned to face the noise. The wind had picked up again, the trees swaying ominously, but the movement he heard was coming from closer, just behind the tree line. He reached for his gun, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading. They weren't alone. The girl's eyes were wide, her breath shallow as she clutched his arm. Jake placed a finger to his lips, signaling for her to be quiet. He didn't know if it was the men or someone else, but he wasn't taking any chances. Slowly, he moved forward, edging toward the noise, his muscles tight, ready for whatever was coming. The night felt suffocating now, the quiet broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat and the girl's shaky breathing. As Jake rounded the corner of the trees, his heart sank. A shadow moved just ahead. There was someone out there. Someone who had been waiting for them. Without thinking, Jake lunged forward, his hand on the girl's back, shoving her behind him for protection. The figure turned just as Jake reached for him, his instincts taking over. "Stay back," Jake shouted, his voice low but fierce. But the figure didn't listen. Instead, they stepped forward, a grin forming on their face, the glint of a knife flashing in the dim light. Jake's heart pounded, and he knew this wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't chance. The danger had found them, and they weren't going to let up now. He grabbed the nearest branch from the ground, holding it up in a defensive stance, his eyes locked on the figure. "I'm not afraid to fight," Jake growled, though his mind was already working out his next move. He wouldn't let this stranger hurt the girl. He couldn't. The figure took another step forward, but just as Jake was about to react, a loud noise echoed through the woods. A car. The sound of tires crunching on gravel, unmistakable. The men in the SUV. Jake's blood ran cold. They had found them. Again. "I'm not going to let them take you," Jake muttered under his breath, his hand gripping the branch tighter, his mind racing. The sound of the approaching SUV was unmistakable now, the tires screeching as it pulled to a halt not far from where he stood. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't know how many men were in the SUV, but he knew they weren't backing down. They'd already proven they would stop. At nothing to find the girl. "Stay behind me," Jake whispered to her, though he didn't need to say it. She was already tucked behind him, her small frame trembling with fear. She had no choice but to trust him. He wasn't about to let her down. He couldn't. The SUV's headlights pierced through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but Jake's senses were sharp. He could feel the cold, the fear, the adrenaline coursing through him. But the most important thing was that he could feel the girl, her presence behind him, relying on him. They couldn't afford to lose this battle. As the SUV came to a stop, the door slammed open, and Jake's heart raced as several men stepped out. They were armed, and they weren't here to talk. The leader, the one with the cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. "You think you can hide from us?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with menace. Jake didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the branch now in both hands, ready to defend the girl with everything he had. "I'm not letting you touch her," Jake growled, his voice low but firm. The man chuckled, a cruel, mirthless laugh. "You're a fool if you think you can stop us." The other men flanked him, moving closer, their eyes narrowing as they took in Jake's stance. They knew he was outnumbered. They knew they had the advantage. But Jake wasn't about to back down. He wasn't going to give up the girl without a fight. He couldn't. You'll have to go through me first, Jake said, his voice colder now, his eyes steely with resolve. The man took a step forward, his eyes glinting with malice. Fine by me, he said, raising his hand. Take him down. The next few moments were a blur of motion. Jake swung the branch, catching one of the men in the chest, knocking him back, but before he could react, another man lunged at him, slamming him to the ground. The air was knocked out of him as they struggled, Jake's fists pounding into the man's face, but it wasn't enough. More men were closing in. He needed to end this fast. With one last push, Jake broke free, his chest heaving as he scrambled to his feet. He could see the girl in the corner of his eye, still hidden behind a tree, her wide eyes watching, but Jake couldn't afford to look back. Not now. The men were closing in again, and he couldn't let them reach her. He had to get to her. He had to get them out of here. Jake's mind raced as he fought off another attacker, the rain making the ground slippery, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping her safe. He swung the branch again, knocking one of the men off balance, and then he dove toward the SUV. The keys. He had to get to the keys. He couldn't let them leave with the girl. He rushed toward the driver's side door, pulling it open, but the leader was right behind him, grabbing him by the arm. You're not going anywhere. The man spat, trying to pull Jake away from the vehicle. Jake fought back, his hand slamming into the man's jaw, knocking him back just long enough for Jake to get inside the SUV. The keys were in the ignition. Without thinking, Jake turned the key, revving the engine to life, the roar of the SUV's motor cutting through the night. The men were already scrambling to catch up, but Jake wasn't giving them a chance. He slammed the gas pedal, the vehicle lurching forward, knocking one of the men to the side as he sped through the trees, heading straight for the narrow trail that led away from the clearing. He could hear the men yelling behind him, but Jake didn't slow down. He didn't look back. The road was rough, but he kept pushing, the SUV tearing through the woods, branches scratching at the windows, but Jake kept going. He had one goal in mind now, getting them both out of here. The girl was still safe, hidden in the back, and Jake couldn't stop thinking about her, about what she'd been through. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let her go back to them. The SUV barreled through the woods, the headlights cutting through the trees, but Jake kept his foot on the pedal, the engine roaring as he pushed forward, determined to get them to safety. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew they had to keep moving. As the trees began to thin out, Jake's heart raced. They were getting close to the edge of the forest. Just a little further, and they'd be in the clear. But just as hope began to rise in Jake's chest, the sound of more engines filled the air. The men were back. They hadn't given up. Jake gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening on the wheel. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not again. The chase wasn't over yet, but Jake wasn't going to stop until they were safe. He couldn't. Not while she was still with him.